The Democratic Party has a problem. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, known for making anti-Semitic comments, now downplaying the 9/11 terror attacks.
CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.
The New York Post blasting Omar. Here's Thursday's front cover. But some of her radical cohorts are defending her. Listen to this.
All right, everyone, welcome back. You just watched the clip, and there's a lot to process right out of the gate. One particular phrase keeps resurfacing, and every time it does, it sparks the same reaction, because it doesn't sound accidental. It feels intentional, and today we're going to unpack exactly why that matters. This episode focuses on two major confrontations involving one of the most controversial voices in Congress. First, we'll look at how Dan Crenshaw, a combat veteran who sacrificed greatly in service to his country, directly challenged both Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez across social media and televised appearances. These exchanges weren't just political. They were pointed, personal, and highly public. Then, we'll shift focus to a developing controversy tied to alleged large-scale misuse of public funds in Minnesota. This situation has raised serious questions about oversight, accountability, and the role of political networks connected to the issue. The center of everything today, is one key idea: responsibility. On one side, there are individuals presenting themselves as defenders of national values and institutional integrity. On the other, critics argue that certain actions and statements are undermining trust in those same systems. There's a lot to break down, and none of it is simple. Let's step into the full footage and examine what's really happening beneath the surface.
This is just pure racist act by many of those, hateful acts by those, because she does speak truth.
We are getting to the level where this is an incitement of violence against progressive women of color.
Republican Congressman and retired Navy SEAL Dan Crenshaw also sounding off against Omar, tweeting this. First member of Congress to ever describe terrorists who killed thousands of Americans on 9/11 as some people who did something, quote unquote. Unbelievable. AOC coming to Omar's defense with this ridiculous response. You refuse to co-sponsor the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund, yet have the audacity to drum a resentment towards Ilhan with completely out-of-context quotes. In 2018, right-wing extremists were behind almost all of U.S. domestic terror killings. Why don't you go do something about that? Congressman Dan Crenshaw joins me now. I mean, I'm almost at a loss for words, Congressman, and we can just take this one at a time. How would you like to respond to AOC saying that you need to do something about it? I mean, you did lose your eye protecting her, fighting overseas for our country.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot to unpack there, right? And it's like you said, it's almost not worth responding to. Okay, but let's unpack this. Okay, so she thinks that co-sponsoring a bill, by the way, that isn't out of committee yet, means that's how you're defending 9/11 victims. Last I checked, I thought I did defend 9/11 victims. I went overseas and tried to make sure that this attack never happened again, and made sure to take the fight to the enemy that committed it. It's not just her either. It's also her counterpart in New York, Max Rose. I mean, the fact that they would double down on this and try to provide cover for Ilhan Omar when all you have to do really is say, hey, you know, she misspoke, or maybe, you know, maybe she didn't mean it that way. Why don't you say that?
Yeah, all she has to say is I was a little too flip. Perhaps my language was a little too imprecise. I know that 3,000 people died on that horrible day, and those some people were radical al-Qaeda terrorists who we've been trying to bring to justice. But she doesn't do that. She actually doubled down with this tweet. Look at what Omar tweeted about this. This is from, I guess, the other day. The people and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon. That's President George W. Bush. Was Bush downplaying the terrorist attacks? What if he was a Muslim? I mean, George W. Bush. Yeah, I mean, George W. Bush went to Ground Zero when there was still smoke up there, and we didn't even know it was al-Qaeda exactly. And he says, you know, they brought these buildings down. and he went into Afghanistan and he did something about it. What is she doing?
I don't know. I think she needs to hire a different comms director. I don't even know what she's getting at with that particular tweet. Again, there's too much material here. It comes at us every single day, Jesse. And
I think she needs to stop.
Is
I don't like the fact that they try to use her gender or her Muslim faith or her race as a shield. Like, she says whatever she wants. It's crazy and completely irresponsible for a sitting member of Congress. And then the minute you criticize her, she says, "Oh, you're attacking me because I'm a Muslim, or I'm a woman, or I'm black."
Right, and this is the worst kind of argumentation. So what they're doing is they're trying to silence any kind of arguments against them. Why? Because they don't actually have an argument to make. So what they do is they'll use identity to try and silence anyone else from saying anything. You're not allowed to say that because of who I am.
Right.
Well, sorry, no, that's not how things work in a democracy, and especially amongst members of Congress. We are supposed to debate ideas. If you say something, we should call it out. I mean, that is the point of this. That's why we were elected. So to say that you're not allowed to talk about something because of identities is nonsense. And it's also sort of bigoted in itself, because you're assuming that everybody of a certain skin color or gender should think a certain way. And that is really wrong. It's the content of your character that matters. It's the ideas that you have. And that's what we should actually be debating here.
Yeah, because if that congressman or woman said the exact same thing she said, and it was a straight white male, we would still be saying, do not say that. What are you talking about? It has nothing to do with what she looks like. It's what comes out of her mouth. You know, she's, 3 months in, she's already caused a huge headache for Nancy Pelosi, so that's fun to watch. But besides that, I mean, I don't
Pelosi,
see...
by the way, also is a co-sponsor on that bill that AOC mentioned.
Yeah, that's right. All right, Congressman.
I mean, it's nonsense, of course.
Congressman, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for serving our country. You did a lot more than what AOC did, so let's remind everybody about that. Have a great rest of the weekend.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you about this massive fraud out in Minnesota in the state welfare program. Has been under federal investigation since all the way back in 2022. The president told you, though, this week to look into Somalis who, quote, ripped off that state for billions of dollars. He said they contribute nothing. What exactly are you investigating?
Well, Margaret, to be clear, the initial fraud that was discovered by the IRS, for which I'm the acting commissioner, is discovered by IRS Criminal Investigations Unit. This was not an endogenous thing that the state of Minnesota decided we had to go in and clean up the mess for them, and this is part of the continued cleanup. A lot of money has been transferred from the individuals who committed this fraud, including those who donated to the governor, donated to Representative Omar, and donated to A.G. Ellison. But they've been transferred to something called MBSs. And those are...
Mortgage-backed security? What do you mean?
Sorry?
Transferred to what?
These are money the Bureau services, and they are wire transfer organizations that are outside the regulated banking system. And that money has gone overseas. And we are tracking that both to the Middle East and to Somalia to see what the uses of that have been.
Okay, but you have no evidence of that money being used to fuel terrorism at this point, which is what some conservative writers are alleging.
That's why it's an investigation. We started it last week. We'll see where it goes. But I can tell you that, it's terrible. Representative Omar tried to downplay it, said, oh, it was very, it was very tough to know how this money should be used. Yeah. She was gaslighting the American people.
Well, we'll talk to her.
Yeah, but when you come to this country, you got to learn which side of the road to drive on. You got to learn to stop at stop signs, and you got to learn not to defraud the American people.
Well,
let's take a closer look, because there are multiple layers here that deserve careful attention, starting with Dan Crenshaw. Regardless of where you stand politically, his approach in these exchanges is measured and deliberate. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez criticized him over legislation, it appeared to be a strategic moment meant to put him on the defensive. Instead, he redirected the conversation toward a broader principle. Policy should stand on its own merits, not be shielded from critique by personal identity. That brings us to remarks made by Ilhan Omar regarding the events of September 11th attacks. Critics argue that the phrasing used in those comments minimized the severity of what occurred, framing it in a way that felt overly detached from the gravity of the situation. Whether intentional or not, that perception sparked widespread backlash. The comparison that followed to George W. Bush only intensified the debate. For many observers, the contrast between leadership during a national crisis and later political rhetoric felt stark and difficult to reconcile. Another key point raised during this exchange revolves around identity in political discourse. There's an ongoing debate about whether accusations like racism or religious bias are sometimes used to shut down criticism rather than engage with it directly. Supporters argue these concerns are real and necessary to address, while critics believe they can be used to deflect substantive discussion. It's a tension that continues to shape modern political conversations. Shifting to the investigative segment, the tone becomes far more serious. Reports discussed on Face the Nation highlighted allegations of extensive financial misconduct involving public assistance programs. The claim suggests that significant sums of taxpayer money may have been diverted through organized channels, raising alarms about regulatory oversight and enforcement. The concern isn't simply that fraud exists, it's the scale and coordination being alleged. When public funds are involved, the expectation is clear. Systems must be protected and violations must be addressed transparently. Questions have also been raised about whether individuals connected to political networks had any proximity to these issues, and if so, what that means for accountability. During the interview, attempts were made to contextualize the issue by noting that fraud can occur in many places. While that's true, critics argue that large, coordinated cases require a different level of scrutiny, particularly when they intersect with public trust and governance. Ultimately, this discussion comes down to a broader question. How should leaders respond when serious allegations emerge within communities or networks they are associated with? For some, figures like Dan Crenshaw represent a push for stricter accountability and transparency. For others, the focus remains on ensuring that criticism itself is fair, balanced, and not driven by bias. Now it's your turn. Where do you stand on these issues? Do you think identity plays too large a role in shutting down debate, or is it an essential part of understanding modern politics? And how should large-scale fraud allegations be handled when they intersect with political figures? Join the conversation below, and let's keep it thoughtful and respectful. If you want more breakdowns like this, make sure to follow along for future updates.